The police officer broke Michael's laptop, unaware that he was the son of the police chief. But his silence was over. What happened next shocked even the most seasoned. But let's start from the very beginning. Michael stepped out of the university, holding his brand new laptop, a gift from his father, the police chief, for the start of the school year. It wasn't just a piece of technology, it was a symbol. A chance his father had given him to break free from this neighborhood and achieve more than most. Despite everything going on in the city, Michael believed this gift was a step toward a better future. He had only taken a few steps on the sidewalk when a patrol car turned the corner. The vehicle veered in his direction, and Michael's heart skipped a beat. He was used to the police's intense scrutiny, especially when walking alone. Black teenagers often became targets for unnecessary stops, but today he was prepared. He kept walking calmly, hoping to avoid any trouble. However, when the car stopped beside him, he felt cold sweat running down his back. A uniformed officer stepped out without a word of greeting and approached him. "What's that you've got?" the officer asked, nodding toward the laptop in Michael's hands. Michael opened his mouth to respond, but before he could say anything, the officer spoke again. "That laptop isn't yours. Where did you get it? It looks too expensive for a kid your age." Michael felt his blood boil. He tried to stay calm. "It's mine. I'm in college. It's a gift from my dad," he said, but his words were drowned out by the officer's indifference. "Don't mess with me. You're probably just a little thief like the rest," the officer said. Before Michael could explain, the officer yanked the laptop out of his hands and slammed it onto the pavement. The sound of the screen shattering echoed in the silence of the street. Michael stood frozen, his heart pounding in his chest. He couldn't believe this was happening to him. But it wasn't really a shock. He had grown accustomed to being humiliated like this. The officer scowled at him, threw the broken laptop on the ground, and added, "If it really is yours, go show your dad and bring the papers. But if we find out you've been lying, you're going to be in serious trouble." Michael stood there, unable to say anything. All he felt was the pain from the ruined gift, something his father had worked so hard to give him, and the bitter disappointment of how the world treated him, solely because of the color of his skin. At that moment, another car pulled up. It was a senior officer, someone Michael had never crossed paths with but knew by name. When he saw what had happened, his face turned stone cold. He turned to his subordinate. "You don't know who this is? This is the chief's son. Are you out of your mind?" Michael felt a wave of awkwardness wash over him. On one hand, he was expecting support from his father, but on the other, he wanted to handle this on his own. He didn't want to be just the police chief's son. But the officer was already shouting into his radio, and soon Michael could see more patrol cars arriving at the scene. His thoughts were a blur, but one thing remained clear. He was a black teenager in this city, and this moment wasn't just about a broken laptop. It was part of the ongoing struggle, a clash with a system that, despite his family ties, was still set against him. When Michael saw his father, the police chief, approaching the scene, he felt a mix of relief and anger. The officers parted to make way, but the situation didn't get any easier. He knew his father would handle things, but what would that say about him? What would it say about him as a person if he was saved just because of his last name? The chief got out of the car and walked over, eyeing the broken laptop. "What's going on here?" he asked, not hiding his displeasure. Michael stayed silent, unable to contain his emotions. "Didn't you see what happened? He broke my laptop!" Michael shouted, pointing at the officer standing nearby. He was not only disappointed by this man's behavior, but by his own inability to do anything about it. The officer, feeling cornered, tried to justify himself. "He said the laptop was stolen. I didn't know who he was, and everything pointed to that." The police chief turned to Michael, then back to the officer. "You don't know who this is?" he asked calmly, barely holding back his irritation. The officer fell silent, and the chief turned to his son. "Are you okay?" Michael looked into his father's eyes, which showed clear frustration. "Dad, why is this happening? Why am I always seen as a suspect? Why can't I just be who I am?" His voice trembled with anger and helplessness. The chief sighed. "I understand, son, But you know how the world works. I'm fighting for change, but it's not easy. Michael looked at his father, confused. But you're the police chief, Dad. Why can't you make it so people like me don't end up in situations like this? A brief silence. The chief lowered his gaze. You're right. I can't change everything at once, but I'll do everything I can to make sure this doesn't happen again. But Michael couldn't shake the feeling that it was all just words. He was sure that for some people in this city, he would always be the dangerous black guy, even if his father was the police chief. When everything was over, they drove home, and on the way the chief said, "You know, I'll need to go through a few things at the department, but don't worry, we'll handle it." But Michael's mind was elsewhere. His father being the chief didn't bring him any peace. He felt he was the one who had to change things. And even if it was hard, he was ready to fight for respect, not as the son of someone important, but as an individual worthy of being heard. In that moment, Michael realized this fight was just beginning. A few hours after the incident, a video shot by a witness went viral. Michael watched in disbelief as his face, full of shock and confusion, spread rapidly across social media. Comments flooded in one after another. Is it normal to ruin someone's life with false accusations? And what if this was my son? Michael sat in his room when Derek called. Have you seen? Everyone's demanding a response from you. Your dad's reacting to this too. You need to speak up. Michael felt his rising anger and helplessness shift into determination. He couldn't stay silent. He realized that this wasn't just a personal grievance. It was a symbol of the broader injustice faced by black people. The next morning, his father called him into his office. The newspapers and social media were full of headlines. Police chief's son accused of theft, and police officer destroys life of chief's son. His father said, "We need to end this. You have to hold yourself together." But Michael replied, "I don't want to just be the son of the chief. I want people to see me for who I am, not as your son." The chief, understanding his son's point, nodded. "You can speak." Michael recorded a video message. In it, he explained how he had been humiliated simply because of the color of his skin, and that he no longer wanted to be part of a system that treated people like him as suspects. "I don't want this to happen to anyone else," he said, looking directly into the camera. The video went viral. Thousands of people began sharing their own stories in support of him. "You're speaking for all of us, Michael," the comments said. But there was also a different kind of response. "Why bother? Just forget about it and move on." Michael knew that retreat wasn't an option. This was his chance, and he wasn't going to stay silent. A few days later, Michael met with his father. The police chief looked tired, but determined. "I've spoken with my colleagues. We held a meeting with the department. We have a lot of work ahead of us to change things," he said, his voice firm. "But we need to act quickly, Michael. I promise I'll do everything in my power." Michael nodded silently. He could tell that his father was genuinely trying to make a difference, but it wasn't enough. He knew that real change doesn't start in offices. It starts in the streets, in the hearts of the people. And he needed to be ready to not only support his father, but also become a symbol of change. The next day, after a week of heated discussions and protests across the city, the police chief officially announced reforms in the department. He announced mandatory anti-racism training for all officers and a review of all cases involving racial misconduct. But despite the reforms, there was still tension in the air. Michael received a message from Derek. "These changes are just the beginning. We have to keep fighting." In that moment, Michael realized that the struggle wouldn't end with one statement or one video. It would be long and difficult, and he was ready to be part of that movement. He promised himself that he would never again stay silent in the face of injustice. By the evening of that day, he began organizing new actions, bringing people together from all over the city. Protests, rallies, meetings. Michael understood that his story was not just personal. It was the story of the entire city, of the whole country. And now he was ready to stand on the front lines, to change the system once and for all. Meanwhile, the senior officer who had witnessed the incident unexpectedly resigned, citing that he could no longer work in a system that upheld racism. It was an unexpected twist, confirming that change was already underway. But for Michael, this was only the beginning. He was no longer just the son of the police chief. He was a leader, the voice of change. And he knew that now his duty was to fight not just for himself, but for all those who faced injustice every single day.